Good morning. My name is Sarah Emons. As a member of Southwold Council and as chair of the War Veterans Memorial Committee, I'd like to welcome you to this Southwold Remembers ceremony. We welcome distinguished guests from various levels of government and community leadership to honor Southwold veterans and Canadian veterans from all conflicts. The Canadian Harvard Aircraft Association will do a flyover traveling through Southwold from Fingal to Shedden to Talbotville between 10:50 a.m. and 11:10 a.m. We are also anticipating an air tribute from the Canadian Owners and Pilots Flight 75 Association. They will be flying between 11:15 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. So now you can please join me in welcoming Reverend John Brown, and he is going to be presenting a remembrance of some very special people. John?
Good morning. Traditionally, we pay tribute to individuals who have participated in previous Southwold Remembrance services, but who have passed since last we gathered. Today, we remember two pillars of the community whom we have mourned in 2023. Duncan McPhail. Duncan was a resident of Southwold by interest, but he lived in Wallacestown. He was a great neighbor who worked on our behalf as a member of Elgin County Council for several years. Duncan was born, raised, and resided all his life in West Elgin. He spent his life on the family farm in the community he loved. He served his community in many public office positions, from councillor to mayor. Duncan served his extended community as warden of Elgin County in 2020, 2001, and in 2019. In his role as warden, he participated in Southwold Remembers wreath presentations on behalf of the people of Elgin County. Duncan is remembered for his welcoming smile, his signature bear hugs, and his large sense of humor. He was a man who gave back to his community. Duncan McPhail passed away on Saturday, March the 11th, 2023. Our condolences are extended to his wife, Norma, the McPhail family, and the constituents of West Elgin. He is remembered for his contributions to Southwold Remembrance services this morning. It is difficult for many of us in the Southwold community to remember a time when Ken Monteith was not involved as a politician, a volunteer, or a community leader. It will be even more difficult to imagine our going forward without Ken's enthusiasm and guidance. Kenneth Ernest Monteith passed away on Friday, February the 3rd, 2023. Ken was elected federal member of Parliament for Elgin, Norfolk, and served from 1998 to 1993. The record of his public service achievements is too long to list. Ken was active in so many vital community endeavors. He was a master fundraiser, loved to talk politics, and encouraged others to get involved. He was a powerful persuader and loved to mentor those he saw with community leadership potential. Ken Monteith was always supportive of our Southwold Remembers program. He made sure that we had new wreaths when needed and attended services annually. His presence at Southwold functions will be missed. Our sincere condolences are extended to Luella and the Monteith family. Thank you for sharing Ken with us for so many years. I'm going to ask you to refer to your bulletin, please. The responsive prayer as printed focuses on our purpose of remembering our veterans and includes prayers for peace. I'm going to ask you to respond with the bold, please. God, we say thank you for the life and service of our Southwold veterans. We are grateful for our memorial plaques listing the names of our 546 Southwold veterans. We express gratitude for veterans who returned from war and continued to the life of their families and communities. We remember those presently returning from service in our armed forces and the challenges both they and their family face as they reintegrate into society. New wars begin, and years of conflict and civil wars continue. We are mindful of the deaths and injuries sustained in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Please give guidance and wisdom to those involved in resettling those in desperate need, whether in Canada or other nations. Might we be a part of those plans? Please welcome Reverend Diane McPherson.
Later this morning, we will adjourn to the memorial site for the presentation of wreaths. At that time, on behalf of the Silver Cross family, we will honor a man from Talbotville who died in World War I. This is his story. Unlike most of the Southwold volunteers who served Canada in World War conflicts, William Henry Taylor was not born in Southwold or even in this country. However, he did make the supreme sacrifice for his adopted country, Canada. William Taylor was born to parents Thomas and Agnes Taylor in Birmingham, England on December 11, 1880. According to the 1891 census, William's father reportedly earned his living as a sauce and pickle packer. William had at least one younger sibling, Daisy. William's young adult life in Warwickshire County included working as a plumber and spending several years with the 5th Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, a militia battalion in England. In 1907, William emigrated to Canada. The 1911 Canadian census indicates that William resided as a boarder in a Topville, Ontario residence. The census further records that William's occupation was now listed as a laborer in cement work. Elgin Heritage Archives pictures William in a 1908 as a member of the local cement gang. In Morley Thomas's book, 5 Stakes Revisited, Topville Families in 1931, the author writes that William, with Jack Ramey, owned the pre-war local cement contracting firm, usually referred to as the Cement Gang. In addition to finding a place to live in Topville and establishing a career with his own cement business, William caught the attention of a young woman in the community. Jenny Gunning was the daughter of a prominent Topville family. It is not recorded where or how they met. Perhaps it was that both attended the Topville Methodist Church, where William may have served for a time as the organist. On December 27, 1911, William Taylor married Jenny Gunning. The couple took up residence in a cement brick house just north of the Wayside Inn, near the main intersection in Topville. William and Jenny only enjoyed a few short years of married life before World War I broke out in Europe on August 4, 1914. Their lives would be dramatically altered. On March 23, 1916, the 35-year-old cement contractor filed his papers with the Canadian Expeditionary Force and signed on with the 91st Overseas Battalion in St. Thomas, Ontario. On those papers, William is reported as standing 5 feet 8 inches tall, with his weight taken at 158 pounds. He is described as having a clear complexion, brown hair, and brown eyes. William Taylor's training progressed over the next several weeks, and by June he had earned a promotion to Lance Corporal. On June 25, 1916, Corporal Taylor and the 91st Battalion said goodbye to Elgin County. The battalion marched east on Talbot Street, on their way to the Michigan Central Railway Station. Throngs of well-wishers lined the street and congregated at the train station to say farewell to their boys. The battalion traveled by rail to Halifax, Nova Scotia. On June 29th, the 91st Battalion boarded the sister ship of ill-fated ocean liner Titanic. The refitted troop carrier SS Olympic set out from Halifax and headed across the Atlantic Ocean for England. One of the eager passengers was Topville resident William Taylor. Taylor disembarked at Liverpool, England on July 5, 1916. Members of the 91st Battalion assembled soon after to deposit the battalion's colours in Canterbury Cathedral, England. The 91st Battalion was broken up to provide individual reinforcements for battlefield losses. Corporal Taylor was assigned to 36th Reserve Battalion on July 15th. 6 weeks after joining the 36th Reserve Battalion, Corporal Taylor reverted to the rank of private at his own request in order to join a draft of men heading for France. There was no need for a new non-commissioned officer without trench experience. They needed new soldiers to replace battlefield losses. By escalating the process, Taylor was voluntarily putting himself in harm's way. While William was managing his transition to military life, his wife was adjusting to the changes in her life with an absent husband off at war. Commencing July 1916, Taylor established a monthly pay assignment of $20 to be sent to his wife. Private Taylor was transferred to the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion on August 24, 1916. In September, he joined the 1st Battalion in the field before the unit was sent to the front line trenches and in Corps Reserve. Private Taylor would participate in the Battle of the Somme. On the evening of September 20th, the unit relieved the 4th Canadian Battalion in the forward trenches. Over the next few days, they endured ferocious artillery attacks.
We are in support trenches now in the day, and then at night are taken as working parties carrying various things up the line. And I can tell you, old Fritz is not asleep.
The task of guiding German prisoners drew the ire of Bill Taylor on one occasion.
One of them, a fine young fellow, acted like a mule, stubborn. Well, I guess. He kept wandering away from the bunch, so the guards could do nothing with him. I had to touch him up a little bit with my bayonet. He immediately called me a vile name. That finished it. I threw down my bayonet and gave him a good, sound thrashing.
Back on the front line the night of October 9th, the battalion's war diary reported considerable activity by artillery during night. Watching the British advance with his lieutenant was Private William Taylor.
I just reported they were halfway through the village and going strong when, blessed if old Fritz didn't go and drop a shell right by us. Oh no, Bill didn't faint or shout, but handed the glasses back to the lieutenant and began to take off my coat. He would hardly believe it when I told him I was hit. When I got my coat off, I found that a shrapnel ball had passed through the left side of my left forearm, coming out just below the elbow on the other side.
Taylor was admitted to hospital suffering from a shot wound caused by shrapnel. The injury was described as perforating superficial wound of left forearm. Bill was evacuated to England aboard a hospital ship, and on October 17, 1916, he was admitted to 1st Southern General Hospital, Birmingham. Ironically, he was coming back to his community of birth. As Taylor's physical condition improved over the next several weeks, he continued to move through the medical system. On December 5, 1916, he was discharged from the convalescent hospital and attached to the Canadian Casualty Depot. 3 days later, his medical category was assessed as A1, fit for active service. On January 31, 1917, Taylor was discharged from the Canadian Casualty Depot at St. Leonard to the 4th Reserve Battalion. Instead of proceeding back overseas to France, he remained with his unit throughout 1917 and was promoted to acting corporal on November 16, 1917. Corporal Taylor was admitted to Connaught Hospital at Aldershot on January 3, 1918. His condition was assessed as seriously ill with a diagnosis of bronchopneumonia. The following day, a cable was sent to Jenny Taylor informing her of her husband's condition. 1 day later, she received another cable. This one informed her of his death. Following Corporal Taylor's death, his comrades let Jenny Taylor know further details of her husband's death.
Dear Mrs. Taylor, I thought you would want to know about your husband's sickness and death. He had been miserable for quite a while, but would not report sick. 2 weeks before Christmas, he got medicine from the medical officer, but did not like the way he was treated, so would not report sick again. On the 29th, was taken real sick, but wanted to hang out and did until the 3rd of January, and then we sent the doctor to him. As soon as he saw him, he held no hope. He passed peacefully away at 2:45, the morning of January 5th. Your husband was well liked by all the men. He was a good soldier and devoted to duty, which had no doubt hastened his death. Had he kept well and lived another week, he would have been made full sergeant.
I had the pleasure of knowing your husband since he enlisted with the 91st Battalion, and I can assure you I found him a splendid fellow, being of bright, amiable disposition which never altered. He made many friends and no enemies, and all this battalion joined in saying he was a jolly good fellow.
Corporal William Henry Taylor died of pneumonia at Connaught Hospital, Aldershot, on January 5, 1918. He is buried in the Aldershot Military Cemetery. William was survived by his wife Jenny Taylor in Talbotville and his parents and family in Birmingham, England. Although she never remarried, Jenny Taylor continued to be active in her Talbotville community, including participating in the Ladies' Aid group of Talbotville Methodist Church. Following Corporal Taylor's death, his wife Jenny Taylor lived another 30 years as a widow. She passed away in 1948 and is buried in Southwold Township at MacArthur Cemetery.
Well, thank you to Lynne and everyone else who took part and created that lovely tribute. Many of you will have seen the 1963 film classic, The Great Escape. This Hollywood blockbuster is a highly fictionalized account of the mass escape of British Commonwealth prisoners of war from the German POW camp Stalag Luft III. But with us today is a man who will set the record straight and give us an accurate account of the many Canadians who really were part of this audacious World War II escape. Ted Barris is no stranger to our Southwold Remembers services. He has, to our great delight, become a regular fixture here in Shedden. Broadcaster, author, educator, and blogger, Ted is perhaps the country's most recognized and respected storyteller of Canadian military history. The list of Ted's honors and awards is extensive. In 2022 alone, Ted was recognized with a presentation of the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Award and was also appointed a member of the Order of Canada. He is truly a Canadian legend. To detail his book, The Great Escape, A Canadian Story, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ted Barris.
Sunny day and nice and crisp, and the thoughts of important people's contribution like Bill Taylor's. Now I'm going to depart for a second and recognize the public school, Southwell Public School choir, whom I was speaking with earlier. Are everybody alive and well and ready to go? Yeah. Now, are there some veterans in the room? Girls and boys, are there some veterans in the room? Have you seen any? There's a few of them over here, right? Yeah? If you were to describe what they look like, what would you say? What's fairly common about all of them? Yes? Yes, and when you look at them, what are they like? What's common about all of them? They're very kind. Do they look kind of old? Yeah, they are. But they're proud of that age. Now, I talked to you earlier today, and I understood that a number of you have older brothers and sisters who are 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, right? Okay. Guess what? The kinds of service they gave Canada happened when they were your older brothers and sisters' age. Some of them lied at 17 and said they were 18. I don't think that's true among these guys. It's possible. But it's possible. The point is that all the time I'm going to talk to you about an incredible story of men escaping from a prison camp in Poland. I want you to think not of these older guys. I want you to think of your brothers and sisters, 17, 18, 19, and 20, okay? Will you do that for me? As I describe the story, think of them. Don't think of these guys, although they did the fighting when they were your brothers and sisters' ages. Okay, so let's go to our first image here from the my collection of visions. That's the cover of the book. When you know about the movie, I often ask, before I do anything on the story, I ask if there's any Americans in the audience. Are there any Americans here today? Because I can apologize to you ahead of time for the remarks I'm going to make about some of the American culture and filmmaking that kind of changed the story. Anyway, here's a poster of the Great Escape movie released in 1963. And it makes it look as if this is a big breakout, like the walls came tumbling down and all these guys came storming out of the camp, Stalag Luft III. That's not what happened. What did they do? They tunneled out, right? However, this is a Hollywood image and they wanted to make it action-packed. The guy who's kind of important is this guy here, John Sturgis. He was the producer. He got the rights for the original story, The Great Escape, from Paul Brickhill, and he went for 10 years looking for the actors who would portray the important roles and the setting and so on. But it's being an American film, you got to get American bums in theater seats. So what do? You put Americans in those starring roles that The Great Escape describes, the hunks of Hollywood, if you like. You spend about $3 million on the hope that you'll make some money back. And indeed, they made $11 million back in the 60s when they produced this film. The point is, Hollywood never lets facts get in the way of telling a good story. History is not one of their strong points. We all remember the, this is the opening, and remember the theme? It's kind of like the Colonel Bogey March from the Bridge on the River Kwai, right? And all these great names are going across the screen. The actors you're going to see portray the roles of the men who escaped from Stalag Luft 3. Now, Hollywood would have us believe that the Tunnel King, the man who designed the tunnels, was Charles Bronson. He plays the role in the film of a fellow who's from Czechoslovakia, from Poland. He's in America, but he joins the RAF. And remember the character in the movie? He's sort of moody, even claustrophobic. So we got a Czech who's from America, in the Royal Air Force, who's the Tunnel King. Wrong. The Tunnel King was Wally Flutty, born in Chatham, Ontario. Did you know that? Yeah. He actually went north as a young man in his summer times, worked in gold mines in Timmins and Cochrane to get tuition for his schooling. Who better to be the tunnel designer than a hard rock miner, as Wally Flutty was? Not a Czech from America in the RAF, a Canadian. Hollywood would have us believe that the scrounger, the guy who went around getting all of the guards to do things that they didn't want to do. What's a scrounger? What's a scrounger? He finds things and passes them on to people who need them, right? That's what that character does. Go back to that image again. That's James Garner, and he was a famous actor. I think I watched every one of his Rockford Files shows. They were fabulous. Same kind of character. So the American movie makers, John Sturgis, makes this character, the scrounger, a guy born in the States, also joins the RAF. He's got that keen ability to scrounge. And he's got, what is that? Anybody know what that is? It's a DFC. So he's an American in the RAF, he's a DFC winner, and he's the scrounger. Wrong. The scrounger was a guy named Barry Davidson from Calgary. He actually learned how to fly in the 1930s, gets his pilot's license in Calgary at a one airplane, one hangar operation in Calgary. He actually writes to General Chiang Kai-shek of the Nationalist Chinese, fighting the communists. He offers his services. The general turns him down. He joins the RAF. He gets shot down into the camp. He's the guy that gets all the scrounging done. Now, when you look at that picture of Barry Davidson, ladies, if we were doing a remake of the movie, who would we cast? Brad Pitt. Who said that? You're hired. You're hired. Okay? So we got a Brad Pitt character, obviously. Okay? Hollywood would have us believe that the guy who's in charge of all the forgeries, the documents that the guys escaping from the camp would use to get through railway stations and checkpoints, was in this case a Brit. This actor, go back to the image, please. Donald Pleasance, very well known in motion picture. He was actually the only member of the cast who had actually been shot down and imprisoned during the war. So the Hollywood filmmakers made the forger a Brit in charge. Wrong. The forgery chief was Tony Pengelly from Truro, Nova Scotia. Look at that face. He's a baby. But he was so good at, he was a photographer, a lexicographer, a lithographer. When he gets shot down, he's the ideal guy to be drafting all of the forged documents. So it wasn't a Brit who was the forger, it was a Canadian who was the forger. Hollywood would have us believe that this guy, Gordon John Jackson, who was a kind of a matinee idol in Britain, would be the ideal person to be the intelligence chief. So we got another Brit in another important role, taking care of intelligence. Wrong. Kingsley Brown, also from Nova Scotia. He was a journalist, trained at the Hamilton Spectator, the Halifax Chronicle. While he's in Halifax, he learns how to fly. He becomes ideal for the RCAF to hire, to bring into the force. He gets shot down, and he becomes really integral in designing some of the forged documents. Do you get my drift here? This is not, I apologize again to the Americans, this is not an American story. It's very Canadian. Here's a picture from 1940, and in it, there's our forgery king here. Pengelly. No, sorry, that's Brad Pitt. There's Pengelly up there, and that guy back there is Dick Bartlett. He was in charge of coming up with a radio. They smuggled parts into this particular first camp, Stalag Luft 1. Stalag is prison in German, Luft for Air Force, number 1 in a place called Bart in northern Germany. He actually had parts smuggled into the camp, and they built a crystal set so they could hear BBC broadcasts while they were in the camp. The Germans had no idea it was there. My point is, these guys were attempting to break out. You know how many tunnels they built or attempted to escape from Bart between 1940 and 42? 44 tunnels. They all failed because, as Tony Pengelly suggested, we were all working individually. In other words, you had some guys who were expert tunnelers, some guys who were expert at forgeries, some guys who were expert at tailoring uniforms into civilian clothes, all working separately. Pengelly said we realized our biggest problem was we were not collaborating. So when they get to Stalag Luft 3, they begin to collaborate so that they can create the Great Escape. Now, isn't that another important Canadian characteristic? Collaborating. We understand that very well. Okay, here is Stalag Luft 3. Remember in the movie, it's suggested that it was in Bavaria? Remember the movie, it's supposed to be in Bavaria? That's because that was the setting that they wanted to have. It was particularly picturesque. This is not Bavaria. This is Poland, Western Poland. This is actually a wooded area. All that dark areas are trees. And the Germans cut this camp for essentially Commonwealth aircrew. Now, who are Commonwealth aircrew? Anybody know some of the Commonwealth countries? Canada. What else? Another one? Australia. What's near Australia? New Zealand, South Africa. Camp. And they first built this one, the East Compound, in 1942. And ultimately about 1,500 of them are in that camp. And when the camp is bulging at the seams, because the Germans are having great success shooting down air crews, they decide to build another camp, and it becomes, let me go back to the image. This is the camp here, the North Compound, that ultimately is the camp from which the Great Escape occurs. Later in that summer, when that was completed, this is the South Compound. This is where the Americans who were shot down in air forces, a variety of air forces were held. The Americans were here, the Commonwealth flyers were here, the Americans didn't participate in the Great Escape, the Commonwealth Air Flyers did. Okay, you got it? It's a very Canadian story. Now, what's really interesting about this is the men who were in that camp recognized that in order to complete this escape, they had to know the surroundings. This is near a town called Zagon, and at the north end of that image there, you can see railway tracks. The objective in the first hours after the escape was to get men to railway station just on the edge of that. It's about 2 or 3 kilometers north of the camp. And one of the guys actually who was out of the tunnel early is a guy named Bob Vanderstock, who was Dutch. And he was particularly intelligent. He had a number of degrees, so he spoke a number of languages. He was trimmed in a uniform that had made to look him, had been changed to make him look like a civilian, a businessman. He was carrying a briefcase. It was actually a piece of cardboard assembled into what looked like a briefcase. He's now rushing through the darkness on the night of March the 24th, 1944, and he gets to that station attempting to get across the tracks. You remember in the film, there's a sudden blackout at midnight? Remember? That's because there's an attack underway, an air attack, so the Germans cut all the electricity, including in the camp and at the railway station. Now, what Bob didn't know was the Germans had dug a tunnel from the south side of the tracks to the north side so that people, civilians, could travel under the tracks, not traveling on top of them to get hit by trains, to get to the railway station. So Bob gets there, sneaking after having escaped from the tunnel, or through the tunnel to get into the forest. He gets to the south side of the tracks. The lights go out. He has a hand come down on his shoulder, and he thinks, oh my God, they've got him. It's a guard, but the guard simply wants to help him get into the tunnel as a civilian to get to the other side and to be safe getting to the railway station. He's one of 3 who actually completes the home run and gets back to Britain. The two others were the two Norwegians. He came that close to being caught. All right, now I'm going to take you to the ground, and I'm going to show you what the barracks look like down in here. So this is, they're very similar. That's the east compound. Notice how they're all wooden barracks. Each of the barracks had about, maybe 250, 300 men in them. That's about maybe 15 rooms. Notice that all of the buildings have chimneys, important. And it also, look at the dark line along the underside of the building. It's actually up in the air. It's on stilts. Here's me having a look at the stilts a few years later. You can see I'm kneeling next to the stilts. The buildings are gone. The point is, all the buildings were in the air so that the guards on the inside of the camp, who would be looking for the possibility of escapes, could get down on their hands and knees and look underneath the buildings, under the barracks, to look for stuff that wasn't supposed to be there. So the stilts kept the buildings in the air so that the guards, who were known as the Abwehr, they were like, and the guys in the camp were really aware of them, avoiding them. That was the point, to make it look as if anything was going on might be hidden. Now, I mentioned that the chimneys, you can't have chimneys simply sitting on wooden floors in huts. They have to have a foundation, don't they, in order to stand there. That's what I'm standing next to in that shot, is the base of a chimney. So when they actually dug the tunnels, they went down through the center of the concrete and the bricks, down into the ground, down another 9 meters before they actually dug horizontally. My point is that they had to do that to hide it all. So they were essentially digging down into the ground to head out and beyond the wire. There's 2 sets of barbed wire here, about 12 feet tall, and this is the no man's land. This is the area where you get shot if you stepped into it. And of course, Steve McQueen gets shot at in that particular instance when he steps into that area. So the only safe spot, because you've got the guards kind of keeping an eye on the huts, and you've got the sentries on around the edge, the only safe spot to talk, escape committee talk, was on the exercise track. It was kind of like the boardroom of the escape committee. This is where all the information was exchanged among the men attempting to get the escape going. And a lot of that activity couldn't be heard because you're far enough. Now, why would you go down 9 meters before you go horizontally? Because this camp was allegedly an inescapable camp. The Germans had sentries, dogs, machine guns. They had the guards searching around for anything untowards under the camp barracks. They also had microphones in the ground, listening for scraping and digging and the potential of tunnel digging. So this was potentially inescapable. That's why they went down so far. How are we doing for time? Good. Notice the background, there's a granary. In that granary, they had supplies arrive for the men in the camp. Now, this is not a death camp. This is a holding camp for officers, which meant because they were abiding by the Geneva Conventions, the Germans were early in the war because they were winning it, they abided by the Geneva Conventions, which meant that officers did not have to work. They simply had to have a head count, report in the morning and in the evening. The rest of the time, they prepared their foods, they cleaned their uniforms and their barracks, and planned great escapes. Essentially, the Germans left them alone. But they also received goods that were shipped in by the Red Cross from their home countries. Of course, the Germans went through this looking for contraband, but this would help fortify their diet so that they had something to sustain themselves besides the soup and whatever else they were getting. So that all came into that granary and was distributed to the camp. Here's the view from inside the camp looking to the northwest. Look at how barren it is. The Germans chopped down all the trees. There's that guard, that barrier between the inside of this camp and the no man's land there. That's looking across another camp, the north compound, the sentry, and look at all the huts. Pan to the right, again, the trees around, and this is inside the north compound. Look at the guys walking, again, around the track. That building you see on the left-hand side is a theater. We'll get back to that in a few minutes. In front of the theater is the recreation ground. When you go outside into the playground, you have a big area around the school, don't you? What do you do there? What do you do in the playground? What do you play? Soccer? Baseball? They played a lot of baseball in camp. There were baseball teams in every barracks room, and they all competed against each other. But it's also an important area because in that area is where the Germans had the head count in the morning and the afternoon, so that the officers who were working on the development of the escape plan had to make sure they were in that zone when the head count occurred, and they used the playground area as a distraction. I'll get back to that in a minute. And come on. There we go. Sentries, they were told to fire shots at anybody who was in that no man's land between the fencing and the guardrail. Here's a diagram. We sort of turn the whole thing upside down. That's north off to the bottom to the left. All the huts that were designed, all the same. And you can see the tunnels. Whoops. You can see the tunnels in there. When Roger Bushell, who was the head of the escape committee, he gets to the camp in 43, just as the north compound opens, he says, we're going to make life miserable for the people who are containing us here. We're not going to dig one tunnel. We're not going to dig two tunnels. We're going to dig 3 tunnels, and they'll be named Tom, Dick, and Harry. And there they are. They discovered Tom early on and blew it up. They never discovered Dick because it was holding all of their supplies and their contraband. And this is Harry, the tunnel through which most of the prisoners escaped on the night of March the 24th. Now, when you're in a situation where you're digging 3 tunnels, what's your first problem? You're getting rid of the dirt, making it disappear, right? Well, they had a number of options to make sure that they took care of it. One of them, remember in the movie, the guy who had the pouches in his pants? These were little bags, like taking long johns and cutting them off, hanging them inside your shirt and in your pants, down along your legs, and there were strings down into your pockets, so it was all concealed under your clothing. What you were doing was taking sand from the top of the tunnel in one of the huts and going out into the compound and making it disappear. The guys who were out carrying all that sand in their pants were called penguins, because when they were walking with all that dirt in their pants, they kind of looked like penguins. So they called those guys the penguins. Now, in addition to getting rid of the dirt in the, just generally, well, what they would do is the guys would make it look as if they were making a garden for vegetables. So when a guard wasn't looking, the penguin would go to the location where the garden was, stand in the middle of it, pull the little pins at the bottom of the pouches, and the sand would fall into the dirt on the ground, and then the guy building the garden would just rake it away. Now, here's the interesting problem. The sand that was coming from 9 meters down was coarse and yellow. The sand that was on the surface had been bleached by the sun, was white and fine. So that's why they had to make it disappear by raking it in. One of the other things they had in the camp, which helped them, was this fire pool. This is essentially a dugout to collect water. And here I am in the middle of it. And when it rained intensely, water would pool in there. You could almost swim in there, couldn't you? If it were deep enough. Or you could wash your clothes. Or if, because it was a fire pool, you could have a bucket brigade to take water to the fire, which is what the point of it was. But the Germans had dug it deep and laid around the outside the brick, and when they dug down deep enough, guess what they hit? Yellow, coarse sand. So it was spilled out along the edges. They could take the yellow, coarse sand that was coming up from the tunnels, and the penguins could go there and pop the pins, and then the yellow on the yellow would just disappear instantly. So they used that as another place to get rid of the sand. Now, remember I mentioned the business of the, go back here, the playground. It's called the appel ground. Appel is another word for head count, okay? So that area there, they had all their games, baseball, soccer, and so on. And they didn't stage the games unless somebody on the distractions committee, one of whom was a guy named McGill, he was a Canadian, they would create distractions in the playground, things like boxing matches, baseball games, so that the guards and the sentries, who loved sport, the Germans loved sport, would all focus on what was going on in the playground. So that, let's say there was a baseball game going on. So you've got guys on either side of the diamond yelling and screaming for their guys to win the game, and the dust is rising because they're out there in that dirt. And right in the middle of all of that are the penguins pulling the pins, scuffing the dirt into the ground to make it disappear. They had all kinds of ways of making the sand disappear. I want to go back to the digging. Hank Birkeland and Johnny Weir. There's Wally. He was the guy who designed the tunnels from Chatham. Hank Birkeland was from Manitoba, went looking for work in the mining industry in BC, another good miner to have as a digger. The guy on the top, Johnny Weir, was a business guy from Toronto, and he was one of the chief diggers. I don't know why his hair looks like that. It was a bad hair day. But look at his eyes. They're also a little strange looking. When he was shot down in his hurricane, the fire in the hurricane blew him clear of the plane, but it burned his eyelids off. This man dug 44 tons at Stalag Luft 1 tunnels, at Stalag Luft 1, and participated in the digging of all 3 Tom, Dick, and Harry tunnels at Stalag Luft 3 with no eyelids. Now, when they were digging, and Hank was in the ground, he was left-handed, so he tended to dig a little bit to the left as he was digging. Well, Flutty knew that, so after Hank was finished, he sent Johnny in, because Johnny was right-handed. He tended to dig to the right, so that the tunnel kind of evened itself out as it progressed. This is a guy who knew his tunnelers and wisely chose them how to dig. Again, all 3 Canadians. This is inside the hut where Tunnel Harry had the trap door. So imagine, kids, boys and girls, imagine you're going to crawl down where those 2 guys are going down. And you're going to go down about, what's 9 meters in feet? 30 feet. You're going to go down 30 feet to get to the bottom of that shaft and dig the tunnel that way to get out under the wire. Now, this is a really important image. It was actually created by Lee Kenyon, who was a British artwork designer or cartoonist and illustrator. He actually recorded the Great Escape, the actions of the Great Escape, in 8x10 pieces of paper with his sketches. And Tony Pengelly, who was the forger, he would take those documents, roll them up into a very tight cylinder, and stick them in the arms, the pendulum of a cuckoo clock. And that was how they recorded the Great Escape step by step by step. Now, in this image, you can see these 2 guys, they're diggers. And when they actually broke through the floor to get down through the concrete into the ground, they had tilers in, while the tiles that were originally on top of the wood, the tile there to keep the wood from burning, they had 3 Polish tilers, who were also RAF flyers in prison. They actually reproduced the broken tile so that every time they finished in the tunnel and they replaced the lid on it, it looked exactly the same way as it had been before it was broken. So this wooden panel has the tile on top of it. Notice that the stove is pulled away. Now, this is summertime, so the stove wouldn't be working, and the Germans wouldn't be suspicious if there wasn't smoke coming up. In the wintertime, when they were working, they actually connected the stove off its base with these tubes here back to the chimney so that the smoke continued to go up the chimney even though it wasn't sitting on the pad. So these guys are the diggers. Now, they're clothed here, but most of the diggers went down digging in the nude. Why? Because if they went down with their clothes on, they'd come up with yellow stains on their clothing. They'd immediately be recognized, and the cat would be out of bag, okay? So they generally dug naked. Now, this guy here is the trap Führer. He's actually in charge of the unit digging and coordinating all of the actions there. The 2 guys to the door are also known as stooges. They're keeping an eye out for all the action around the hut. And all the way out to the main gate, stooges are keeping an eye on actions going on in the camp. George Sweener is at the main camp entrance. He was known as the duty flyer, the duty officer, and he's keeping a lookout for guards coming into the prison, into the camp and compound. And he's sitting there at the gate with a kind of a clothesline effect, and he's drying his laundry by the gate entrance, the compound entrance. He's got socks and shirts and underwear, and every once in a while, he shifts the position of his socks and underwear on the clothesline. He's not switching it around just to dry them. Each one of those positions is a signal for who's coming through the gate. That signal gets passed back to the 2 guys at the doorway, and if there's a guard coming, they tell the trap Führer it's time to shut it down. The 2 guys on the way into the tunnel disappear down the shaft. They put the stove back in place, and everything gets shut down in less than 60 seconds so that nobody knows that anything's going on. This guy in the foreground is gathering lumber. You'll notice that it's got a lot of it. If you're digging down 9 meters and out 360 feet and then back up 9 meters on the other end of the tunnel, you've got a lot of sand to shore up. And the only way they could do that was with lumber. And where was the lumber in the camp? Every one of the bunk beds, and there were about 1,800 to 2,000 bunk beds in the camp, had all those cross members. Well, every bunk bed gave up a certain number of cross members so that they could be brought to the edge, sent down the shaft, and installed into the walls of the tunnel. So this is all perfectly organized to make sure that the tunnel is safety, secure, and safe from being discovered. By the way, the dimensions of the tunnel, we think of it in the movie as being fairly large. The tunnel is only as high and as wide as the length of the bunk bed boards, which means that the tunnel was actually 22.5 inches wide and tall for 360 feet. You don't want to be claustrophobic in there. Now, let me go back to, here's the shaft. Remember I was telling you about going down the shaft? Guys, look, that's right at the bottom. I'm looking back to the underside of the trap door. Doesn't that look like a long climb? Would you like to do that in the dark? No, I don't think so. No. But that's what it looked like. And the problem with the lumber that they used, often it was infested and rotten. And sometimes as the tunnelers were working in the tunnel, they would hear creaking and cracking. And that was a signal to get the hell out. Why? Because the timber would break and the sand would pour in like water and they would drown in the sand. And there were a number of instances which I record in the book about that. All right. At the bottom of the shaft, there are 3 rooms. Here's the shaft here. Here's a side cutaway. So you got hut 104, room 23. The stove is off. There's the shaft down the 9 meters. And you've got the guys sending the sand up and down to be dispersed by the penguins. This little room here is a workshop, and it's being organized by Jim McKay. He was a carpenter, cabinet maker from Orillia, Ontario. His job was to handle the construction of a number of things in the tunnel, not the least of which were those pieces of wood. Now, you'll notice that he's actually beveling out the end of a piece of wood from the bunk bed. See them there? They actually beveled it. You know, when any of you who've done some cabinet work, if you have joints at the corner of a piece of cabinetry and you don't want to use screws and nails, what do? You dovetail it, right? So these pieces of wood, which are going to go into the walls in the tunnel, were dovetailed together so it would be like without the use of screws and nails. Why is that important? Because if you were banging them into the wood, that would be heard by the microphones under the ground. So they essentially made this a prefab wall. And all these pieces of lumber would go down and be installed in the tunnel. He's sitting on a Red Cross box. They didn't throw anything away. These 2 guys are either on shift or just off shift waiting their turn. Now, another of the room elements at the bottom here is a bellows. One of the problems they faced at Stalag Luft 1 was that when they were digging down underneath the ground, they didn't have enough air. The guys would come up puking and gasping for air within about 20 minutes. They decided that they would have fresh air given to the tunnelers, and by keeping the shaft open, the chimney open, the air would naturally circulate down, and they built this contraption to essentially be like a bellows. You know when you're at a fireplace and somebody has one of those little things that blows air, and it makes the flames go higher, right? That's what that is. It's a bellows. So it's blowing air into the tunnel so that the tunnelers can breathe. And the guy who was on it constantly was this guy, Gordy King, from Winnipeg. Is this a Canadian story, or is this a Canadian story? All right. Here's the face of the tunnel, right at the end. Now, it took me a while to realize that the danger that they faced in this was that the guy who was actually putting the walls into the sand had to create a cave-in so that the walls went up like a friction fit to essentially hold the sand back. So he's having a cave-in happen on himself, digging it back out, putting in the walls, and advancing toward the end of the tunnel. Now notice his hair. Does that remind you of the guy Johnny Weir we heard earlier? Same guy, Chief Tunneler. There he is. Now Johnny, I never met him. I met his wife, his widow, about 15 years ago. No longer than that. In any case, when I met her and she found out that I was doing a book about the Canadians and the Great Escape, she was thrilled because she wanted Johnny's story to get out there. So I visited her in North End Toronto. You know the Casaloma area, that very high area in downtown Toronto, where you look down and you can see the lake and the CN Tower. And when I went to visit her, she was thrilled, and she gave me all the stories about Johnny and his actions and how his heroics and so on, digging the tunnel, and how he recovered from having lost the eyelids and so on. Anyway, we sat through the afternoon, and she brought out cookies and tea and more cookies and tea. The dog came over and put his head on my lap. We talked. We just finished the conversation, and I was about to leave, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Barris, you might be interested in something that I have for you about Johnny's experience in the camp." I said, "What's that?" She said, "All his letters." Of course. And the letters Obviously, he wasn't going to say in the letters, we're digging a tunnel, I'll see you at Christmas, because all the letters were censored. But he could write in the letters code, and that's exactly what happened. Here's an example. He says, the pajamas you sent to me in the July parcel came just in time. My others were sort of at their bum ends. The folks at home, the families, were allowed to send to the officers in the camp clothing and food. So Robin at home, his girlfriend, they weren't married yet, sent him his silk pajamas at his request. She didn't know why he wanted the silk pajamas, but every time he requested them in the letters, she would pack them up and send them into the camp. Now, how many pairs of pajamas do you go through in a year? Maybe in this crowd, not very many. Never mind. Anyway, the pajamas arrive, and quite unsuspectingly, the Germans think there's nothing awkward about that. But guess what? All those pajamas were being used by the diggers because they were silk and they shed the sand. They didn't reveal the yellow staining. They became the uniforms of the diggers. Okay? That's how Robin was helping Johnny with the escape. He also points out in the letter, darling, what we need now are gramophone needles, or are they practically non-existent at home too? The Germans allowed the officers to have books and newspapers and magazines. They had a gramophone machine. In fact, once a year, the Mackenzie King government was allowed to send Bakelite discs and needles into the camp so that the officers could play them on the gramophone. Now, we all remember hi-fis and turntables and needles. How many did you go through in a year? Not very many. They would get hundreds and hundreds of needles. Why were they so important? If you took a steel needle from a gramophone and you rubbed it on a magnet, and you magnetized the needle, and you put it on a fulcrum, and you took broken glass and melted it for a see-through top, and the Bakelite disc for the base, you can create what? A compass. Everything that an escaper needs has to be essentially led by a compass. Al Hack, who was one of the Australians, he was building compasses. They made 200 of them, and they stamped in the bottom of every one of the compasses as a recognition of its origin. Just as the Bakelite was cooling, they pressed into it Stalag Luft 3, just so that anybody who got one knew ultimately that's where it was made. So all this is going on subterraneously. I mentioned the pajamas. Now, another of the guys I talked to, or his family, Frank Sorensen, Frank also mentioned that there was something needed. He wrote home and said to his mom and dad, would you send me the thesaurus dictionary at the home library? And I asked his daughter, Vicky, when I got the letters that Frank had sent, why would a guy who was in a camp want thesauruses? I said, what was his occupation? She said he was a dentist. What the heck did dentists need with thesauruses? Not at all. But he kept asking. After this one, he asks another time, Arsenal's handkerchief, blah, 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 would like thesauruses sent. How many of you have looked at the thesaurus? When you go into, I'm a writer, so I have a bunch of them. The point is, when you go into one, somewhere in a thesaurus, particularly the Rogers, you'll notice that there are a dozen or 15 pages in the thesaurus offering translations for street language in all of the main countries of Europe. English, French, Spanish, German, all there in the thesaurus. Why is that important? Because if you're learning how to escape and you have a capability with linguistics, you want to know the terms for where is the station, how do I find a washroom or whatever. And they use this as a means of training the guys who would ultimately be out getting through German and Polish towns, how to get away. In addition to which, they had an aide. Gordon Kidder was among those captured. He was a scholar born in and lived in St. Catharines. He was invited to study his German at Johns Hopkins University. Instead, he decided to go to an insurance company. When he gets shot down, they decide he's going to be the guy who teaches all these guys how to pronounce all those street phrases. So he was there teaching, and what he referred to when he would bring the men together for these sessions, they were culture appreciation sessions, so that the guards wouldn't be very suspicious. And when they gathered, when I went back to Stalag Luft 3 a few years ago, I went with Gordon's nephew, Gord, named after him, because you see, Gord, his uncle, was among the 50 executed after the escape. So I went with Gord and walked around through Zagan and through the camp, all sensing from his walk he was looking for where his uncle had been in the camp and where he'd served. I mentioned a security. Paisley Brown was the journalist. Now, where did journalists generally hang out? Boys and girls, what's a journalist? someone who writes journals or for newspapers and magazines. Now, would you find a journalist in a library? Yeah. Why? Because they're researching. He spent his time in the German library going through the magazines and the newspapers and all the documentation that was coming in that's freely available to the officers. He was there so that he, an accomplished journalist, could steal identities so that they could build forged documents with all the right people's names in the right places. They would take the interior end papers of Bibles, which were clean paper on both sides, tear them out, and they became these Überschwein. These were essentially documents that would allow a worker to pass through a checkpoint. And this would take, in some cases, as long as a year to craft one of these, with all the names and all the documentation in the right place so that the escaper would have what he needed to get through a checkpoint. The final element, which was not determined until they actually decided when the escape was going to occur, was the date. Because they didn't know when it would happen. It went on the 22nd. They decided that they were going to escape on the 23rd, 24th. They essentially dated all of the documents the 23rd of March, 1944. Now notice this too. See this stamp? That was actually created by someone taking a leather boot heel and carving into the boot heel the letters of that essential stamp, which would essentially verify the document, or essentially the final seal. So he would carve into the leather boot that insignia, which would then be pressed in ink and then put on the document. But bear in mind, if you're doing it into the boot heel, it would have to be in reverse. That's a good trick. That's why it took so long to do these things. Now, in order to make all this work, they had really accomplished artists. The guy on the left is Rob Buckham. He was a Toronto artist. He said, I learned to become a great forger thanks to the Group of Seven. That's because he took training from the great Arthur Lismer, who was a master of detail. And Lismer told him all about detail, and so when they needed detail in the forged documents, Buckham was the guy. There's Frank Sorensen again. Frank Sorensen, by the way, was walking on that inside track around the camp teaching Roger Bushel Dutch, or Danish, because he was originally from Denmark. All right. They played a lot of baseball, as I alluded to earlier, in the camp. There were hundreds of baseball teams. Al Houghton from Beaverton, Ontario, he was a Penguin, helping distribute the dirt, but he was also a good baseball player. There he is right there. And he was a member of the All-Star team, the Canadian All-Star team. I say Canadian because when Americans started pouring into the South Compound, and they saw the Canadians and others playing baseball in the North Compound, every blue-blooded American wants to show his great game to those interlopers. So they actually got the commandant to allow the Americans to go into the North Compound for a tournament of 3 games against the Canadians, which the Germans all watched. And the Americans thought, where was the game of baseball invented? In America. So they thought they had this in the bags, right? So they come into the North Compound, and they thought they were going to blow the Canadians away. What the Americans didn't realize was, on the Canadian team was a guy named Bill Payton, who just happened to be the best fastball pitcher in the Bombay Beach League in Toronto, and they beat the Americans 3 games straight. In fact, at one point, the umpire, who's the senior Canadian officer, goes out, he stops the game, marches out to the mound, he says, Bill, none of the Americans have made it to first base yet. Bill said, and they won't. Dick Bartlett, he's the guy that smuggled the parts into the radio. Now, they were all transferred from Stalag Luft 1 in northern Germany to Stalag Luft 3, and they had this crystal set, and they had to get it from one place to the other, and there were all kinds of checkpoints and interrogations, and they would go through all their gear. How do you hide a radio? Well, they had sports gear, which the Scrounger had pulled together, including a medicine ball. They probably don't know what a medicine ball is. It's a kind of a big ball you throw, it's heavy, and it's for calisthenics, to build up your muscles by throwing this big ball to each other. The Germans didn't check inside the medicine ball. That's where the radio was. And it went from Stalag Luft 1 to Stalag Luft 3, and there it was in the latrine, and they pulled it in, put it into a latrine in a Red Cross box. This guy is listening to the signal coming in. It's only receivable. They can't transmit. This guy's taking notes. He could go around to all the huts and pass along the news that came in. And if there was trouble looming, a guard coming, they would put the radio back into the Red Cross box, pop it into the non-working toilet in 60 seconds, and no one was the wiser. All right, how are we doing for time? About another 5 minutes or so? Okay, the theater is really important. A lot of the men who were in that camp Canadians, Brits, Rhodesians, South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders were very intelligent, educated men. And they had this craving to perform. So they asked the Germans if they could build a theater, which they did. And they built the theater with odds and ends from around the camp, wood and so on. And they also built a foundation. Okay? Here's the inside of the theater. It's a raked floor. All these are Red Cross boxes, which have been converted into seats. There was an orchestra pit. There was a backstage. There was a fly area. A very sophisticated theater, all to deliver a new show every week. So much so, and so beautifully did they do this, the Germans insisted on having reserved seating every time there was a new show. Now, here is the orchestra pit, and in it is Art Crichton, who was an RCAF airman from Edmonton, a scholar, a music scholar. He conducted the orchestra and insisted when they had a performance of whether it was Shakespeare or Shaw or musical theater, everybody was in uniform in the orchestra. But poor old Art was scared to death the Germans would find out what was going on beneath his feet. Remember what I told you? There was a foundation. And in the wintertime, after they discovered Tom and they had a bit of a hiatus and they started digging again in the wintertime, where do you hide yellow sand in snow? Okay? So they actually dug up, made a false seat in one of the seats, the chairs, which had a trap door into the basement of the theater. And every night the Penguins came and started dumping sand into the basement. And a chicken farmer from Victoria had a tamping team, and they tamped all of the dirt into every corner of the basement. And here's what it looked like years later. I'm standing in the orchestra pit. So we're up on the stage. Okay, so I'm in the orchestra pit. And that's where the performers would be. And out there would be the theater. Of course, the superstructure is all gone. And then up beyond me, that pile of grass is growing on dirt that was deposited there between January and March 1944. There's 50 tons of sand they dumped in there. The Germans had no idea it was going on. Okay? Now, backstage, this is another Lee Kenyon sketch. There's all kinds of preparation for all the shows. They had guys learning lines. They had costuming. Look at this guy in the background here. He's dressing up as a woman. Just like in Shakespeare's time, the men had to play the female roles. And they weren't wobbling around on high heels with squeaky voices. They were very, very convincing as female impersonators. The guy on the right, anybody guess who he is? Tony Pengelly, the forger, the ultimate forgery, impersonating a woman on stage. He said, I spent the war in drag. And they performed every week. The Germans were there, had no idea what was going on beneath their feet. Okay, now the night of the escape, the 24th, as we all know from the movie, they came up short of the woods. That's because the Germans kept carving back the woods, expecting the tunnel to pop up. And when it did, it was short of the woods. So they had to rig up a system where, now we're outside the north compound. And this is the up shaft on the inside of the woods. There's the prison behind. The lights are shining into the camp. So they rigged up a little system with a rope used in a bit of a blind in the woods. And the guy would pull on the rope every time the sentry was marching the other way. The guy would pop up and take off. Between 10 o'clock on the night of the 24th and 6 o'clock on the night of the morning of the 25th, they got 80 men out of the tunnel. 80 men. There were 200 of them waiting to get out. They planned to get 200 out. They got 80 out before a guard spotted somebody in the morning, fired off a shot, the whole thing ended. Okay, so now you got 4 of them were captured right at the mouth of the tunnel, or the shaft. So you got 76 guys on the run. Hitler finds out about this, and he says, I want all of them caught and executed. And somebody points out to Hitler that there are a lot of Germans in POW camps in Britain and in North America. Maybe it's not such a wise idea to kill them. So here's the Gestapo and SS mathematics. They decide to kill half of them. Well, half of 80 is not 50. They executed 50 of them, the officers. And it wasn't like it happened in the movie where, remember in the movie, they gather them all up, throw them in trucks, and then they come to a spot and they peel off and let them get out and stretch the legs, and they mowed them down with a machine gun. I found documents which shows you how they were executed. They brought in Gestapo thugs who, just like gangland killings, took them out in 2s and 3s and murdered them in fields and burned their remains. The documentation illustrates all of this. It's not very, comfortable stuff, but it's the way this thing ended. This guy sat in Berlin determining which of the guys who had been captured would be shot and which ones would not be. He sat over lunch determining this. He later was found to be complicit in an attempt against Hitler's life, he was executed as well. So they all got each other. Anyway, the Germans try to cover up the escape and the murders by saying, in the course of an enterprise to recapture British Air Force officers who had escaped in large number, some of them offered resistance on being arrested, which wasn't true. After recapture, others tried again to escape on the transport back to the camp. In these cases, firearms had to be made use of. 50 prisoners were hereby shot. The suggestion was that they had resisted and they'd been killed in the resistance. This guy knew otherwise. Skeets Ogilvy. He was one of the Canadians. There were 9 Canadians who got out. 3 of them survived. 6 were shot. He essentially tells the British when he gets back to Britain that the executions were just summary, and they took 50 of them and took them out and killed them. Then they went back into, after the end of the war, they went back into Germany and Poland. They tracked the guys down who had actually been complicit in the murders. They went to trial in 1946, and all those guilty were executed. Here's the tribute that the 50 men are remembered at, the same place I was at with Gord Kidder, the nephew of Gordon. Now, the story isn't over because the prison break was in March of 44. There's still a whole year of the war to go. And the relations in the camp went from bad to worse. So in that standoff, essentially, ultimately, the Germans who are now feeling their necks because the Allies have landed by this time in 45, it's the coldest winter of the war. The Germans figure we're going to use the prisoners as chattel, as bargaining chips to get out of the war. So they march. Now there are 10,000 prisoners. They march them overland west toward the Canadians and the British and the Americans coming from the west to deal with them to get out of the war. And these guys now are marching, and the Allies have control of the airspace over them, and they look for all the world like German soldiers marching. They were strafed and bombed by their own guys, their own air forces. So many of them, having survived the camps on this long march, die on the way out. And they get to the locations in Western Germany where they're all being holed up because the war is ending. British arrive, Canadians arrive, tell the prisoners, you're free. Well, that's nice. Now what do we do? How do we get back? Well, because there was no further bombing after May the 8th, 1945, when VE Day happens, Churchill sends every available aircraft, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Dakotas, to go in and retrieve these guys and bring them out. And Kingsley Brown, who came out in a Lancaster, he's in the nose of a Lancaster, lying down where the bomb aimer was. He sees the Europe disappearing behind him as he's going out of Europe, and the pilot in that Lancaster brings it down so that the guys can see that they're leaving all this in their dust. And he sees, as the Lancaster leaves and comes over the channel, he sees in the distance the White Cliffs of Dover. And he writes in his memoirs, they were just like I remembered them, just a little bit blurry. He was weeping. And he comes and he lands, and they don't know what to do with these guys. They feed them rich food, and of course their stomachs can't take it, and they barf all that up. They take their uniforms off them because they're lousy, full of lice. They burn them, put on new ones. They keep doing this. They don't know what to do with these guys. So in the last chapter of the book, I talk about how these guys came home, how they resettled back into civilian life. Many of them couldn't handle it. And some of their stories are actually very dramatic, post-traumatic stress stories, which indicate the nature of their imprisonment. Okay, just two last shots. Here is a shot. Now, why would there be a photograph of all these guys together in the camp? Well, the Germans wanted to indicate to the prisoners that if they wanted to, we would send photographs home to your families showing them how well we're treating you. So they gathered all these guys together in groups. This is the group from Ontario. Ontario. Look how many members of the Escape Committee. Pengelly, the forgery chief. Hank Sprague, the trap Fuhrer. Joe Noble was a scrounger. Johnny Weir was a digger. McCabe was a carpenter. George Wiley, he was in charge of all the distractions. Don McKim from Simcoe, Ontario, he was a stooge because he was short. He could get around where no one could see him. These are all the guys from Ontario only. There were shots of every other part of Canada, every other part of the Commonwealth, indicating where these men had come from and how they were all involved in the Great Escape. So there's a Hollywood view of the Great Escape, the famous motorcycle scene. Steve McQueen insisted on having this scene in the movie and all the business with the motorcycle because he didn't like the fact that James Gardiner had all the screen time and he wasn't getting enough. So he wanted more and he was going to walk. So they put all this in, including all these jumps and so on. So that's Hollywood's view of the Great Escape. I suggest to you that mine is more of the historical view of the Great Escape. And remember, all the stories I've told you are the stories that could have been carried out by your older brothers and sisters, but were done by these young men all those years ago. Thank you very much.
I don't know about you guys, but for my money, I'll take watching Ted Barris over a movie any day of the week. Thank you so much, Ted, for setting the record straight on The Great Escape. Your presentations are eagerly anticipated and always appreciated, and we will invite you back again next year to join us again in Shedden. The choir is now going to assemble on stage. Immediately following this tribute to His Majesty King Charles III, Parade Marshal Will Alden, the Legion members, and the cadets may adjourn from the front of the Keystone Complex to assemble the color guard outside. Everyone else will proceed via these rear exit doors directly to the memorial site for the presentation of the wreaths. We ask that if you are able to, you join the Southwold School Choir in singing God Save the King.
Attention, we're going to wait for the Harvards to come over and then we'll proceed.
Clear?
Who's that guy? Good morning. My name is Bill Harris. Welcome to our 24th Remembrance Day service in Southwold. Sarah has mentioned the flyovers. We've already had one. We will also have the Cadet group come through, at which time we will pause in our service to observe the missing airmen salute before resuming our presentations. I am assisted today by Reverend John Brown and Reverend Diane McPherson. We will also be favored with two selections from the Southwold School Choir under the direction of music teacher Jennifer Szturm. Our parade marshal is Alden.
Let us pause, let us pray. O Lord our God, in this place of memory we offer our words of prayer. Today we are acutely aware of the fact that our freedom did not come lightly. For so many people around the world, in the midst of present conflicts, for the people fighting discrimination and oppression, they long for the freedom that is ours. For the veterans who have died and those presently serving in our armed forces, we pause to say to them, thank you, thank you. Help us to teach our children and grandchildren how much we are in debt to those who have defended us in the past and those who still presently serve, to the end that we may live in freedom. Help us to make Canada a worthy of their dedication and sacrifice. God bless our troops, and may God bless our country. To that we can all say, Amen.
Please bow your heads as we remember those members of our community who have fallen in service for their country, and to acknowledge the courage of those who still serve. Assisting with the presentation of wreaths this morning are the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 41 Color Guard, Number 7 Royal Canadian Army Cadet Corps, 741 Elgin Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron.
You may be seated if you wish. With us today is Southwold Councillor Scott Fellows to present the wreath on behalf of the Silver Cross family of Tottetville's Corporal William Henry Taylor.
We are joined by representatives of government, veterans, and the community for the presentation of wreaths, memorializing our war dead. Representing the Government of Canada, Mike Vecchio, on behalf of Karen Vecchio, MP, Alden, Middlesex, London. Representing the province of Ontario, Deb Ransom, on behalf of Robert Slack, MPP, Elgin, Middlesex, London. On behalf of the County of Elgin, Gordon Ed Ketchum. Representing the municipality of Southwold, Mayor Grant Jones. Representing the city of St. Thomas, Mayor Joe Preston. Representing Canadian Armed Forces, Captain Rob Fuller. Representing Southwold Veterans, Rosemary Player, in memory of Southwold Veterans, Arnold and Noel Litster, Rosemary's father and her uncle. Representing the Royal Canadian Air Force, Second Lieutenant Kevin Rivar. Representing the Korea veterans, Paul Rochon and Robert McGinn. Representing the No. 4 Bombing and Gunnery School Association, Brenda Longhurst, in memory of her late father, Lawrence Bison. Representing the 31st CER, the Elgins, Warrant Officer Derek Lynch. Representing the Royal Canadian Legion, Branch 41, Wayne Donnelly. On behalf of the Indigenous Veterans of Oneida, Sarah Emons. Representing 427 Wing Air Force Association, Sam Newman. Representing the Ontario Provincial Police, Constable Brett Fair. Representing Dutch Canadian families, Ida Martin. Representing Warren Lodge 120, Todd Noble. Representing the Southwold Youth, Olivia Sutherland. On behalf of the Southwold History Committee, Karen Collard. We now invite children in attendance to participate in this morning's service by placing a wooden cross at the memorial site. I ask that all children come forward and receive their crosses from our Silver Cross family representative, Scott Ells.
We will remember them. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.
I want to share with you the benediction. O God, we remember those who are forever young in your presence. Guide us today, tomorrow, and in our future as we continue to work for peace in our generation. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with each of us. Amen. We now have a special musical selection from the Southwold School Choir.
Canada with the singing of our national anthem.
Great. Then, come
color party. Scary colors.
Very well done. This concludes the 24th Annual Southwold Remembers Day service. Our Memorial Committee sincerely thanks everyone who participated in events this morning. We invite you back inside the Keystone Complex for fellowship and refreshments. Dead Bears is available inside the Keystone Complex for anyone interested in purchasing a personalized copy of The Great Escape, A Canadian Story. You may also contact the Southwold Township office to order the book. Please join us for Remembrance Day services next November the 10th, 2024. Parade Marshal, march off.